Welcome. My name is Natasha Sherman, and I am your host. And my guest today is the renowned academic neurosurgeon, Dr. Eben Alexander. So after decades as a physician and teacher at Harvard Medical School and elsewhere, Dr. Alexander thought he knew how the brain and the mind and consciousness worked. And a transcendental near-death experience, or NDE as they are referred to, during a week-long coma from an inexplicable brain infection changed all of that completely. His books, Proof of Heaven, A Neurosurgeon's Journey into the Afterlife, and The Map of Heaven, How Science, Religion, and Ordinary People Are Proving the Afterlife, have collectively spent more than 2 years atop the New York Times and international bestseller lists. Welcome, Dr. Alexander.
Well, thank you for having me, Natasha. It's great to be here.
I'm so thrilled. I know you've been on Oprah and Dr. Oz, and the fact that you would make this time for us is really pretty incredible. So thank you.
I'm just happy to share my story and do it all the time. I mean, it's a pretty natural thing. And of course, the world gives me back stories, and that's the real gift that I get out of all this.
Yeah, so let's tell a bit about your story to start with.
Well, I think it's important to point out my background. I grew up in North Carolina. My father was an academic neurosurgeon, but he was very religious. My father, even as the scientific chairman of a neurosurgical training program, his knowledge of science and the brain and all that never challenged his view of God as being absolutely real. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and like so many from that era, always have known that science is the pathway to truth. What my coma journey showed me very clearly back in 2008 is that the materialist science that I worship before coma, that's kind of our conventional version of scientific understanding, which basically says the only stuff that exists in this world is the physical, and that things like consciousness, soul, spirit are epiphenomena, they're illusions of the physical brain. And that's what I believed fully going into my coma experience, and yet that's why it was such a gift. In fact, the vast experience that I report in the book Proof of Heaven could never have happened if all of my beliefs from before about brain creating consciousness and the physical is the only thing existing were true. And this is where our science is now expanding greatly to a much deeper understanding. Now, what happened deep in my coma, as I said, could not have happened given my diagnosis of severe gram-negative bacterial meningitis. And the reason is that kind of bacterial meningitis destroys the human part of the brain. It's a perfect model for human death because it devastates the human part of the brain, and yet it also is almost always fatal. That's why I'm often asked to speak to medical groups, surgical groups, etc., about my experience, because they realize that it completely violates all of our conventional scientific preconceptions and erroneous thinking about the brain, mind, and consciousness. Now, the essence of my journey, it all began deep in what I call the earthworm eye view. Now, important to point out that my entire near-death experience was somewhat atypical compared to other experiences because I was amnesic for the life of Eben Alexander. I remembered nothing of my life before. In fact, I had no words, no language, had absolutely no knowing of the beings that had accompanied me in the first 54 years of life. And when I first came back from coma, I explained all that defaulting to my old conventional neuroscientific view, which said that if you wreck the neocortex, which my disease had done very effectively, then that wipes out all memories. So my initial assumption was, I guess it makes sense, given my meningitis, that I would have no memories. It's important to point out, though, that when I first woke up from my coma on day 7 in that ICU bed, I didn't even recognize my mother, my sisters, my sons standing at the bedside. I had no idea who these beings were. So very important to point out that my brain really was wrecked from the experience, just as my doctors predicted, and just as they would have told you. To this day, my doctors have no explanation for how I possibly could have recovered, and also how in the world could I have had any experience. They kept telling me you can't have experienced anything because they had the evidence when I first came back from my neurologic exams, from my CT and MRI scans, from my lab values, that my gram-negative bacterial meningitis was so severe that it would have eliminated all but the most rudimentary forms of conscious awareness. And that's why to have an extraordinary ultra-real experience, which is actually what I had deep in coma, was completely mind-bending. It violated and defied all of our pre-existing notion of brain creates consciousness, that the neocortex is responsible for detailed conscious awareness. Now, the pieces that I did recall deep in that coma that were so extraordinary, and of course, people who want to know more can read Proof of Heaven, because that's where I expand on all this. But it started in that earthworm eye view, very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm, like being in dirty jello. Even though all my words and language and every memory of human existence was gone from my awareness, I could still kind of wonder who, what, where, and there was never a flicker of response to any of that. But I was rescued from that kind of deep, dark, murky realm by a slowly spinning white light that came towards me and opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view, and opened up into this brilliant ultra-real realm, the Gateway Valley that I describe in great detail in the book Proof of Heaven. Now, this Gateway Valley was only the first of many layers of what people might be tempted to call heaven from my experience. But it was one that is very common. It's where we reunite with our higher souls. That's where we go through our life reviews. That's where we plan our next incarnations. And so in that...
I'm going to interrupt you here for just a second. So before this, you had never really considered reincarnation or soul review?
No, because...
Go ahead.
No, I was a conventional reductive materialist neuroscientist. I believe the brain creates consciousness out of physical matter. That's kind of what our conventional science says, and I bought into that fully. So I'd never paid any attention to reincarnation. I always thought memories are stored in the brain, and yet modern neuroscience has not the remotest clue that is true. Nobody has any evidence, certainly not a location in the brain where memories might be stored. And it turns out, that I basically needed to go through a far grander education. That's what a lot of the 7 years since my coma has been, is trying to learn more about the deep mystery of consciousness, what's called the hard problem of consciousness, which is the deepest mystery known to all of human thought. But anyway, getting back to my general journey, this Gateway Valley was beautiful. It was idyllic. It was kind of a perfect ideal world. I often liken it to Plato's world of forms, but one that is there for our personal soul journey, because no human being has ever experienced anything other than their personal soul journey and how that interacts with all the souls around them, and is part of the one mind, the one consciousness that is evolving. So in that Gateway Valley, there were butterflies, lots of waterfalls and sparkling pools, incredible life and fertility and growth, and blossoms and buds on trees, flowers blooming, all this incredible life, no sign at all of any kind of death or decay in any form or fashion. And of course, there was a beautiful girl beside me on the butterfly wing, and this is something that is a crucial piece of the story told in Proof of Heaven, because in fact 4 months after my coma is when I actually got the evidence together that proved to me the reality of the journey. And I don't want to have to put out a spoiler alert here and go into all the details of that, but it has to do with the fact that that beautiful girl, who was my guide, my guardian angel on this journey, and then when I started reading the near-death literature in the months after my coma, I came to realize she should be someone who was very important to me on my journey in my life. And yet I knew her so well, and the messages she gave to me so crucial, and what it revealed to me about her very soul. The messages being, you are deeply loved and cherished. You have nothing to fear. You will be taken care of. And I cannot tell you how profoundly liberating and refreshing those messages were at that point in my journey. But it was a deep mystery to me when I came back, because I had no idea who this woman was. And to me, that was a parallel mystery to the fact that if I had scripted my near-death experience, first and foremost, I would have encountered my father, He was such a tremendous influence to me. As I said, he passed over 4 years before my coma, and yet he was nowhere to be found in the journey. And in the 4 months after my coma, those two facts came together. The fact my father was not there, the fact that this beautiful woman who I didn't recognize, even though I could remember her perfectly, I remember her to this day perfectly, and yet I'd never met her before in my life. And to me, that was a big struggle. And that's what I point out in the story Proof of Heaven. But that's all revelation came to me 4 months after the coma. Back inside my coma journey, this beautiful idyllic valley was just the beginning of collapse of multiple layers, ascending into higher and higher levels, always with sound, vibration, frequency, music, serving the portal for my soul to ascend those levels. That's why the melody that ushered me up from the earth from my view up into that brilliant idyllic valley, the Gateway Valley, was music, musical notes, and they were very important to recovering that portal later, because I would spontaneously ascend to higher and higher spiritual realms, all the way out to the most profound level I reached, which I call the core, that infinite inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with the infinite healing power of unconditional love of the divine, of that deity that goes far beyond any kind of words or description at all, that deity. And of course, when I came back, I called that deity Om, because Om was the sound I heard in that realm, in that core realm, that infinite oneness. But at its very boundaries, you could discern how all of the universe emerges from that oneness, from that pure sense of love. But the most crucial fabric of that realm, of that core, of that oneness, was that love. And this is such a crucial part of the message I bring back to this world, is the infinite healing power of unconditional love to heal all, whether it's healing an individual, a soul group, healing all of humanity, all of life on earth, all of consciousness throughout the universe. However big you scale it, unconditional love has infinite power to heal. This is an ancient lesson, but one that our world has obviously not really taken to heart. It's time we move beyond that false sense of separation. And part of that false sense of separation has to do with our interpretations of these deep spiritual journeys. I would say that all of our religious systems originate in near-death experiences or similar spiritually transformative experiences, and the encounters coalesce towards one major kind of knowing of the reality of that deity, of that being. But I came back realizing full well that that God loves Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, skeptics, atheists. That God loves all. And this is part of the confusion of our modern era. And in the book Map of Heaven, I go into this in a little more detail about talking about our current era and the destiny of humanity over thousands of years, and why I see all of this as perfectly appropriate for where we are to be now. And it's part of understanding that. But my journey and what I share in Proof of Heaven, in the Map of Heaven, and in all my talks, in this kind of interview, that journey of my awakening mirrors perfectly what our modern scientific world and scientific thinking world, the journey that we are on, in realizing that consciousness itself completely defies any kind of simplistic physicalist explanation. And that's why science has had such tremendous difficulty. Materialist science, I should point out, that says brain creates consciousness, has had such difficulty because they've made absolutely zero progress along the lines of trying to understand how physical brain could give rise to consciousness. That is something called the hard problem of consciousness. If you Google the hard problem of consciousness, you will come up with the most profound mystery facing all of human thought in all of our history.
So, wow, well done putting all that into a short, it's just mind-boggling, especially coming from your perspective as a scientist. And then also, the fact that the brain wasn't functioning in the way it would need to be functioning if consciousness, if the brain was the seat of consciousness.
Right.
So I do have a question. In one of your talks, or in the book itself, you mentioned that the word God, in a sense, the way we envision God is much too limited. It's kind of a tiny little explanation for this mystery and the experience of this unconditional love and consciousness. And so when I take it into kind of my experience of religion, a lot of religion for me is fear-based. And what you're saying is, or there's a lot of punishment and there's a lot of watch out kind of thing. And what you're saying is that the message you got is you are loved, you are safe, you will always be loved. There is nothing that is going to take that away from you. So then how do we reconcile that with what we're taught on this earthly plane?
Well, I would say it's very important to point out that so many who have near-death experiences come back with this incredible sense of the loving comfort, embrace that is there from that creative source of this whole universe. The very core of our consciousness is that deity, and it is what is creating all of this emerging world. Now, and as I said earlier, I believe that all of our religious systems have descended from these kinds of journeys. I mean, these extraordinary journeys that are the absolute antithesis of normal waking consciousness are what people have been through and had to come back and try to explain. Now, what I would point out, though, is I think the original message of the prophets, whether you're talking about Buddha or you're talking about Christ or Muhammad or what have you, those messages, from my point of view, are always very pure and have to do with the oneness that we all share, that we're all part of one consciousness, that in fact, if you don't need some massive influx of intellectual enlightenment to get this, all you have to really know is the golden rule. You know, given that we are all one, that explains why we should do unto others as we would have done unto ourselves. And that's really kind of a fundamental way of looking at all of the great religious systems. But then they get hijacked. They get hijacked by others who are trying to control human beings by taking the messages of the prophets and then trying to pit us against each other, trying to make us, force us to choose sides and say, well, my religion is correct, yours is wrong, and therefore we are at battle. That is not the way it really works. The deepest message, as I see it, from all of the prophets and the great systems of religious thinking converge in their mystical roots. And that was something that was made very clear to me as I started giving talks about all this, which began 2.5 years before Proof of Heaven came out. And I would make these amateurish DVDs of these talks and send them around to people, and they got distributed pretty widely. And then I started hearing back from people. I would hear from Kabbalists, from Jewish mystics, and I would hear from Sufis, from Islamic mystics, and Christian mystics, and Buddhists, and Hindus, and other meditators, transcendental meditators. And they were telling me how basically the core message, the core part of my journey, as it was portrayed in the book Proof of Heaven and in my talks, was right in line with their most ancient teachings and traditions. And I began to realize that, in fact, all of our great mystical and spiritual traditions converge to one kind of truth, but it's only through this Tower of Babel, through our linguistic brain that is very tightly tied to ego and to sense of self, that, the linguistic brain does what René Descartes pointed out it does best. To define is to limit. It starts setting up false boundaries and limitations. And we think that that is necessary for our kind of limited human bandwidth to understand things. But it actually gets in the way tremendously, so that religious dogma is often quite separatist in its preachings.
I'm going to interject something here. I heard this expression once, at first there was God, and then the devil came and created religion. And it kind of points to that. One of the things you said in one of the books was that you think that inherently in each of us there is some memory of heaven. And I was trying to look at that, and for me it really resonates, because I think I work with a lot of people, and there's this kind of yearning that everybody has. It's a yearning to connect. It's a yearning for a deeper connection. And we see it evidenced in times of disaster, where people just automatically come together and connect, and it turns out to be like a pivotal moment in their lives, the most meaningful moment. And so there's evidence of it everywhere if we look for the signs, And I think that's one of the accesses to kind of starting to get that we are all the same and we are all in this together, and it is all part of one, so to speak. But I wanted to ask you, on a day-to-day basis, it's like, and I think it was Anita Moorjani, maybe it was you, who said that kind of coming back after this near-death experience, you've expanded and you had this tremendous experience and kind of universal experience, and then it's like stuffing the genie back in the lamp.
Right.
You're
It's
kind
very
of
difficult.
yeah, it's kind of cramped, and so do you find that, and because now you're back in a human body with all your human reactions, how do you find on a day-to-day basis that you continue to process this, and what is different?
That's a beautiful question. I would say that any one of us can come to cultivate this and nurture this knowing of the oneness of all consciousness and our connectedness to all fellow beings through meditation. I mean, I'm really shocked that anybody would choose not to meditate. Meditation brings so many benefits for health, for guidance, for kind of being one with the world, being comfortable with everything that is going on in your life. I mean, meditation brings tremendous power to our health, everything else. But I meditate daily. I try to do it an hour or two or more if I can. And the reality is, in deep meditation, we can come to know the very same things. This is why I've helped develop the tools that I've developed with sacred acoustics, because this provides a form of very powerful differential frequency audio brain entrainment. So if you just go to sacredacoustics.com, download their free listen through headphones, you can start seeing what I'm talking about. But it has to do with cultivating this sense of the one mind, that we are all truly in this together, that it makes eminent sense to make our decisions out of love. If we realize that loving ourselves first and foremost is a crucial step forward, because in fact, I would say when I came back from my coma journey, I realized that one of the biggest problems in our world is we don't even love ourselves enough. And we think the challenge is that we're supposed to love our neighbor and love our enemy. Well, how can we even do that if we're not loving ourselves? But by doing that, we're actually recovering a memory that we are eternal spiritual beings that are intimately connected to the divine source of all of this universe, to that God, that deity. And that's why I love meditation, and often tell people you don't have to die or almost die to know everything I know of these realms. You can get to it through a lifelong practice of deep meditation. And that oneness is a crucial concept. And we can come to realize that our minds especially are connected as one. All of conscious awareness is connected as one. And this goes far beyond just being human beings.
Are there any, I know, and I think I heard someone saying, I think it was Anita Moorjani who said the same thing. The first lesson is you have to love yourself. And truthfully, I think most people loathe themselves at some level. And so, on the one hand, some people are going to resonate with meditating because they're ready to hear it. But are there any tools on a day-to-day basis that people can use to remind themselves? Because we have so forgotten this.
Well, again, going within is beautiful. You've got to realize, first and foremost, the little voice in my head is not my consciousness. I love the way it's put in the book, The Untethered Soul, where he refers to that voice in our head as an annoying roommate. That is a very good way to look at that little voice of our ego and the false definer of boundaries of self. Our conscious awareness, that is the observer part within us, that is our consciousness. That is the part that we can develop fully and come to realize it is not bound by these false notions of self. And that's why I think this kind of lesson has so much practical value for each and every one of us. Your conversation a few minutes ago, in dealing with those around us and all the hardships and challenges we face, remember that in fact, so much of that apparent conflict with other people is through the identification of certain aspects of their persona that do not necessarily click with our persona because it's a problem within ourselves. And that is one of the interesting twists in psychology, to come to realize that often what we don't like about other people is a part of ourselves that is active, that is reflected in them. And that's why meditation is a beautiful way to step outside of ourselves, step outside of that little egotistical voice and its false boundaries and how it's trying to defend the ego. Take that much grander view. The much grander view always allows us to see a win-win situation for all involved. And that is a beautiful gift to get. And that can come just from meditation and going within and realizing that connectedness and oneness.
And I think it just occurred to me that one of the things is when you suggest to people, look in the mirror and say, I love you, I think where they're relating to it from is the ego. And so, I'm lacking here, I'm lacking there. Perhaps maybe they can just say, I love the essence of who you are. I love your spirit. I love your soul, because your soul is pure. And I think most people on some level can relate to that. But you talk about how it's really important now, especially at this juncture in time, that we start to pay attention to that message. So in the last minute, maybe you could say something about that.
Well, I think this awakening is happening for a reason. As I try to point out in the map of heaven, from my point of view, all of this really makes perfect sense when you look back over thousands of years of human thought. Go back to the time of Aristotle and Plato. Watch how all of our thinking, both East and West, has emerged over these centuries. Look at the rise of the natural sciences the last 400 years and how it has fostered this kind of belief in the myth of materialism, as if the material is the only thing that exists. All of us are participants in the evolution of consciousness. Each one of us is a microcosm of this great awakening that is coming to humanity. We're all doing our own part, and we do it for our, quote, selves. But in essence, what this really means is we are all evolving with all of humanity to realize the oneness that we all share with all life and all consciousness throughout this universe. And it brings tremendous benefits. We must awaken. Yeah. We've kind of painted ourselves into a corner in terms of climate change and other disasters, modern warfare, thoughtless homicide and suicide. A lot of the consequences of these successes of science and technology of the 20th century is obviously also an ugly underbelly. Yeah. And this is because of the mismatch between our spiritual growth and awareness and our kind of intellectual, technological, scientific growth that was basically allowed to go unbridled in the 20th and early 21st century, because we had separated from the fact that we are truly spiritual beings living in a spiritual universe. And that is a crucial fact to recover.
Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time, but I think that's a great place to end. And really, it's our job to take on our personal evolution, but we are part of everybody else doing the same thing. And you started out by saying, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Dr. Alexander,
more complicated.
Thank you so much for being here today. And I encourage everybody to check out the books, check out your talks on YouTube, because it's very worthwhile. It can alter your life. Thank you.
Thank you. And people can reach me through ebenalexander.com. Thank you so much.
And we'll put that on screen at the end as well. Thank you.
That would be great. Thank you.
My name is Natasha Sherman. Thank you for joining us.